A federal court has blocked a new congressional map in Texas drawn to favor Republican candidates. The Texas legislature redrew its congressional districts this summer at the urging of President Trump with the goal of netting 5 new Republican seats in next year's midterm elections. But a panel of U.S. District Court judges in Texas has now blocked the new map over concerns that it amounts to racial gerrymandering. Sarakshi Rai, Deputy Managing Editor here at The Hill, joins me to discuss. Hey, Sarakshi, so give us a little fresher on what the Texas legislature actually did here.
That's right. So a federal court blocked Texas from using its newly drawn congressional map in next year's midterm, basically ruling that the map is likely an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. Now, this ruling is a huge setback for President Donald Trump and Republicans, who had made Texas a real centerpiece of their national campaign to redraw maps ahead of the midterms. You know, Texas announced it would appeal this decision and it would go to the Supreme Court. Now, this court has ordered Texas to use its previous map, which, you know, the state enacted after the 2020 census. Now, the new Texas map aimed to help Republicans flip 5 Democratic-held House seats next year. And it really kicked off a rush of redistricting efforts from both parties across the country. And we've seen this happen in California. There's now a push in Indiana, right? And the Justice Department has joined a similar challenge to the new Democratic-drawn map in California, which was enacted in response to Texas aiming to flip those 5 Republican-held seats. So the redistricting war really is in full effect right now, Drew.
Okay, so after the legislature drew these maps, you had some voters in Texas, the NAACP, some Democratic elected politicians brought this lawsuit. What was their argument?
Look, the court found that the plaintiffs will likely succeed in showing that the race predominated over partisanship in the map-making process, right? And they said that the state legislature appears to have set and followed a racial target. Basically, you know, they were saying that the public perception of this case is about politics, to be sure, and politics played a role in drawing the 2025 map. Now, this was a direct quote from U.S. District Judge Jeffrey Brown, who was appointed to the federal bench by President Trump in 2019. And he said that this redistricting map was more than just politics. Substantial evidence shows that Texas racially gerrymandered the 2025 map. So essentially, you know, what we're seeing is that the plaintiff said that this was a politically motivated racial gerrymandering decision done predominantly to ensure that the Republicans had an advantage. Now, we know that redistricting is not new. It happens from time to time in states, you know, and that's why we saw some of these maps being redrawn after the 2020 census. But essentially what the plaintiffs are arguing here is that this is done on a racial basis and should be, basically reverted back to the previous map, Drew.
So what's going to happen now? Is this going to end up at the Supreme Court? Will Texas Republicans eventually get their way?
That's right. So Texas is very likely to ask the Supreme Court for what's known as an emergency stay, which is basically a fast-track order that would pause the lower court's ruling and allow the challenged congressional map to take effect while this case plays out, right? Now, if the court grants it, the racially gerrymandered map could be used in the 2026 elections, despite a federal court's finding that it was drawn to dismantle minority and Democratic-leaning districts in violation of the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act, right? So as it stands right now, the request first goes to Justice Samuel Alito, who oversees emergency appeals from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. He can issue a stay on his own or refer the decision to the full court. Now, we know that Justice Alito has previously sided with Republican officials in redistricting and voting right disputes, and a stay could come quickly and potentially before candidates' filing deadlines close on December 8th next month, right? Although a stay is not a final ruling, it would essentially suspend the district court's injunction and immediately clear the way for GOP's map to be used. And because the candidate filing deadlines are coming up, an emergency stay, even if temporary, would effectively decide the issue for the 2026 election cycle. Now, even if the court later rules against Texas, it might be too late to reverse it, Drew.
So if the Supreme Court doesn't step in and undo this lower court decision, how big of a loss will that be for the GOP?
This means essentially that the lower court's ruling will remain in force, basically blocking the gerrymandered map from being used in the 2026 election. And this would be a historic victory for those bringing this case and a clear signal that the justices aren't willing to intervene, at least for now. It could also mean that the court is allowing the 3 judge panel's findings that the Texas map intentionally dismantled districts where minority voters could elect their candidates in violation of the Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Constitution to stand. Now, without a stay, Texas essentially would revert to using the previous congressional map, which, like I mentioned before, was drawn after the 2020 census. It's the same map that was used in the 2022 midterms that preserved several competitive or Democratic-leaning districts that the GOP had targeted in this mid-decade redraw, right? Now, Texas could still ask the court to take up the case in full and issue a final ruling before November 2026, but without a stay, the path to using the gerrymandered map this cycle effectively closes, and the burden now shifts to the state to argue why the ruling should be reversed. So very complicated, but essentially, this December 8 deadline for candidates filing is coming up, and that's when, it either the map stays or it goes away, and that's when we'll know more about this.
This isn't the only case of redistricting that kind of isn't going along the way of the Republican Party. We have what happened in Indiana, where state officials are kind of resisting the president's urging to redraw the maps there. We had this decision in Utah that could open up a seat for Democrats. Kansas has had some issues in redrawing its map. And of course, in California, they were able to pass this referendum that opened up to a redrawing of its maps to actually favor Democrats. How is all this kind of coming together?
That's right. So California's Prop 50 essentially stands on its own the way it's been written, right? So its authority for a legislative redrawn congressional map in California does not depend on any action in Texas or any national redistricting trend or any reciprocal state-level challenge, right? And regardless of how the Supreme Court handles the Texas appeal, whether this gerrymandered map is revived or blocked or litigated into next summer, California's Prop 50 map will proceed on the timeline set by the state law and the state constitution. Now, California is facing its own legal battle on that challenge, but the fight is specific to California and not related to anything unfolding in Texas. Now, when it comes to Kansas, the redistricting was on the fast track, and then some Republicans said no. The state's top Republicans wanted to join President Trump's push to redraw congressional maps, but the plans for a special session fell apart when some lawmakers resisted those efforts to kind of change those maps and redistrict there. And now we know that in Indiana, President Trump and his allies are threatening to unleash war against those Republicans in the state over redistricting. We've heard from the president recently on the Indiana redistricting, specifically on Truth Social, and he basically said that he will primary GOP holdouts in the state who refuse to redraw the state's map. He also cranked up pressure on Indiana Governor Mike Brown to get his members of his party in line. So essentially, as this stands, this redistricting fight is going to be front and center for the 2026 campaign, Drew.
Yeah, a lot happening here. We'll continue to follow it. Sarakshi Rai, thanks so much for your time.